Hi, I'm Lawrence Krauss, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. This week's episode is with Brian Keating, an experimental astrophysicist and cosmologist, an old friend. I've in fact appeared on his podcast some time ago. Brian has studied for most of his career one of the most interesting bits of data from the early universe, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang. In particular, was involved in an experiment looking for an imprint in that radiation that would come back from a far earlier time, in fact, the very earliest seconds or less of the Big Bang itself, during a period called cosmic inflation. If we could measure that signal, it would reveal to us an incredible amount about physics and maybe even about the existence of other universes. Brian and I talked about those aspects of physics and physics more generally, and his own experiences as a scientist, and also his interest in science popularization. It was a fun discussion. I hope you'll enjoy it. You can watch it on our Substack site, Critical Mass. If you subscribe to that site, you can see the ad-free video of the podcast, or you can watch it on our YouTube channel, or you can listen to it on any channel that allows podcasts to be broadcast. Either way, I hope you'll really enjoy the discussion, and I also hope you'll consider supporting the podcast through the Origins Project Foundation, which runs the podcast and also other public events and outreach activities. Well, Brian, it's great to be able to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's nice to be here, the Origins Podcast.
Yes, and I appreciate you talking to me, even though you're recovering from COVID, or are now recovered safely from COVID. And
yes, I've never been so positively happy to be negative.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's nice you talk to us from home. The wonder of communication in the modern world. Look, we have chatted before, and it's always fun. And I want to have a chance to talk about some things we haven't had talked about, which is mostly your work and your background. And as you know, this is an Origins podcast, so I like to talk about people's origins. And I want to begin with yours because I've known some things about it, but I want to be I wanted to be able to go into depth in a way that I hadn't before. Your father was a well-known mathematician, right? As a well-known mathematician, but well, I wondered who. But I also know that you sort of were disconnected for a bunch of years when your parents got divorced, and you later on reconnected. And if you don't mind talking a little bit about that, I would be happy to find out about that sort of influence, because I would guess that his influence as a mathematician affected you later rather than earlier when you were very young. And I wondered what got you interested in science at the beginning. Like, was your mother a scientist? So those are a whole bunch of questions.
No, she was brilliant. She is brilliant. She thankfully is still alive. My father, of course, passed away very young, 69 years old. Mm-hmm. But no, my mother didn't give me any scientific. I mean, it's kind of, I'm a scientist despite my father being a scientist, and despite my mother being a non-scientist. It was kind of a way to teleport me away from the strife that divorced children go through, or children of divorced parents go through. It was very de rigueur in the 1970s, as people may know, is kind of the hip thing to do. And they were very much influential on me. My father more at a distance, and almost despite, sometimes, Lawrence, you can be get just as much value from a weatherman who's always wrong than one who's always right. Although, speaking here in San Diego, it's hard to be wrong very often.
It's always it's cloudy in the morning and sunny in the afternoon. But anyway,
72 and sunny. So my father was kind of a counterexample, and I wanted to be as different as possible. I felt like he had abandoned me and my elder brother at a young age, and gone off and done stuff for himself, and despite his brilliance. So, for example, he was the youngest full professor in Cornell University math department history. He was 27. I think he was a full professor. Now, mathematicians get tenure earlier anyway, but he was full professor, age 27. And when I applied to Cornell as an undergraduate, I didn't even mention that my father had been a professor there, and so I wanted to succeed on my own merit. Of course, I didn't get in. Neither time did I apply that I applied to, but I went to the best Ivy League school eventually. Anyway, Brown University.
Well, we can debate that, but if I was not accepted at Cornell, which was my safe school for graduate school. because I had two professors of mine as an undergraduate, and they both did their PhDs at Cornell. So I figured, oh well, that's my safe school. I got into MIT instead, yeah. So it's all kind
You're
of
right.
random.
Yeah, life works out in a way. But I
Yeah.
ended up, going to Case Western, where you would later become my incoming department chair as I left, and that was a wonderful university for me. They were phenomenal professors. It was 4-to-1, teacher to student ratio. And I was back there a couple of years ago to speak at homecoming, and I really didn't take as much advantage of that university as I probably should have. Always thinking about, I should have gone to MIT or Cornell or whatever.
Yeah.
But again, it didn't seem to harm me very much. So I think my father's influence, I really didn't discover. I didn't talk to him from age 7 to age 21,
Wow.
22, when I started to have inklings that, maybe there was a virtue to making peace with this, by then older man who, I didn't even remember what he looked like.
Wow.
And so my brother and I got in touch with him through, these our Jewish grandmothers. They weren't talking to each other, but they had friends that talked to each other down in the Bermuda Triangle of Florida, that I call the Yenta net. And these Jewish grandmothers, bubbies, got together and connected me to my father. And one day he called me up at Brown in my dorm room, and he said, "This is James Axe." And I said, "Oh, okay, wow." I recognized his voice instantly. It was pretty funny. And this is 1990. Yeah, it was. Even though I hadn't really heard his voice, and the voice is so powerful.
Yeah,
it's even more powerful than the visual in some ways. And I felt this connection. We talked for hours on the phone, and he had moved to Los Angeles and was living outside of LA, and invited me and my older brother to come visit him. And one of the first things we did is take a paternity test to prove that he really was our father.
Did he require that?
And he required it, yeah. And I was kind of, my mother was very insulted. She probably still is to this day. I was so sure that it would come back, positive, with no uncertainty, that I was willing to do it just to prove him wrong and get on with my life. And then by the time we came out there, got the results, it was 99.97%, as he used to say, genetic garbage. And so it was pretty. I said, no, nobody's perfect, but for a long time I couldn't really bring myself to even call him dad. Like I would say you, or hey. It was very hard because I had lived with another man for 15.
Who brought you up? Essentially, your father. Yeah, not your biological father, but your father. Yeah.
And that's Ray Keating, and that's whose name he adopted me. And so my brother and I changed names. We changed religions. I was brought up Jewish, and then when they got divorced, my mother remarried an Irish Catholic man with 9 brothers and sisters. And I converted at the time to being that most Jewish boys would have their bar mitzvah. I was converted to being a Roman Catholic altar boy in the Church of St. John and St. Mary's in Chappaqua, New York.
In Chappaqua, New York. Okay, well you were lucky that you missed the bar mitzvah stage. I think that was a gift, having gone through it myself.
Going back, Lawrence, you'll be interested to know. So next year I'm going to be 52, and that's the 4th anniversary of my bar mitzvah, and I'm going to go to Jerusalem and do my bar mitzvah at the Wailing Wall with my family, God willing, and that will be an event for the ages. Because it's kind of funny that I grew up, as I said, as an altar boy in the Catholic Church for a few years, and then the person that converted me away from Catholicism was this guy, Galileo Galilei, and I discovered him even before I discovered you, and cohorts that made me really question the Catholic Church. And I don't think it was that sophisticated, to be honest with you, Lawrence. I feel like a lot of people go through this phase, and you and I talked when you were on my podcast about at what level would I accept the refutation of, right now there's all this brouhaha in the popular press that the Big Bang never happened. I don't know if you're following this, but
I tried.
But there's this guy who's been around since I was a kid, Eric Lerner. He's not even a scientist really by training. He has no formal education, but he puts a lot of videos. Anyway, he's saying all this, and I was thinking, well, he's very convincing if you're not very sophisticated. A lot of the things that he's saying makes some sense, but when you look deeper, I was thinking, well, maybe he has like an understanding of certain topics and people want me to debate him. And I always find it, kind of almost a waste of time, because you're not going to change the ideas of somebody who already is so committed, confirmation bias, to want to believe something, and you give it oxygen. And so I put out a video kind of debunking some of his claims about the JWST findings that supposedly are crisis in cosmology. But I was thinking, way back when, if I had heard this as a 13-year-old, maybe I would have believed it, maybe not. And so I think that's the challenge of overcoming staunchly held ideas. And that wasn't really your question, but going back to the influence of people, I think I was always looking for a father figure. And I've been blessed to have people remote, long dead people like Galileo and Einstein, all the way up to people like, the modern day people like Barry Barish we were just speaking about. He's become a mentor.
Say me if you want.
You could say. I don't want to. I don't ever take the chance that it goes to your head.
Yeah, no, heaven forbid. Yeah, heaven forbid.
That would never happen.
Barry's a wonderful guy, so it's great. Well, look, I think. Did you, speaking though of father figures, or at least going back, because I want to go back, did you read much? And for me, reading about science was really what turned me on when I was a kid. And in fact, I don't know if I've told you in our podcast, but it was actually a book about Galileo that was the one that really turned me on to think of science as a romantic and daring activity. But did you read much science and popular science when you're?
I did. I actually read a lot more science than science fiction, which kind of puts me at strange odds. As you know, I'm the associate director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination here at UC San Diego, where you've visited me a couple times. It's nice to when you come to town. But I always read the science fact or science nonfiction of Isaac Asimov. He was really the biggest influence on me as a kid, and so much so that I wanted to be like him, to write books, to be a professor, to teach, to educate at scale, which I think you and I both do nowadays. And for me, that kind of blend of the creativity, the poetry, it was only much later that I read Galileo's work from a nonfiction perspective, and had the honor, along with Frank Wilczek, your friend Frank, and Carlo Rovelli and many others, to Fabiola Giannazzi, to record the first ever audiobook of Galileo's dialogue. And that changed my life.
Yeah, I want to get to Galileo at the very end, but I mean, the dialogues are amazing. In fact, I think I told you, I've always required my non-physics and non-science students, when I teach physics, to read some Galileo, as we'll talk about. But we'll get there. But Galileo, certainly. And by the way, Asimov was one of the ones who had a big effect on me, his nonfiction books. I never read any of his science fiction. Everyone thinks I'm like a science fiction aficionado because of the physics of Star Trek. And I read a science fiction of a guy named John Wyndham more than the other people. But science fact always still continues to fascinate me more than science fiction.
Carl Sagan said, and I know you're a huge fan of Carl's, and I heard your podcast with Jeff Marcy. Yes, absolutely. These long dead books speak to you in your head. And I think now with audiobooks read by authors, and you've read your book, The Greatest Story Ever Told. I listened to that again last year, the second time. And, having the actual voice now, a lot of people say, well, what are you going to leave for your kids? And I'm like, there's millions of hours literally that are available. People can watch and so forth. And I feel like, I just can't imagine what it'd been like to have Carl Sagan or Isaac Asimov or, even Jane Goodall in her prime to be, on a podcast. I mean, it's so incredible. But I think, that search for father figures, less, unfortunately, just less so for mother figures, is just what was in the reality back then. Now, thankfully, there's, tremendous numbers of good authors on both sides of the gender spectrum. But I do feel like books are becoming sort of second tier. I wrote my first book. One of the marketing people at Norton, said, well, who is this for? And I started to say, well, for everybody. And they're like, that means nobody. And they asked me, well, what's your competition for your books? I said, Lawrence Krauss is no. I said, it's Brian Greene or something. And they said, no, you're wrong. It's every cat video ever made on YouTube. Like, that's your competition. Because people now, it's so digestible. They can just get stuff without even selecting. The benefit of TikTok now is that you don't have to have decision fatigue. You just get this thing fed into your brain. And I forbid my kids to watch it, or these stories and so forth. because it takes no effort, not even the effort of listening to an audiobook. It's so detrimental to the developing mind. And I don't think I would be a scientist nowadays if I grew up with all the paradoxical choices that we have. It's overwhelming. And I think it's ultimately, to the intellectual mind, the scholastic mind, I think it's very damaging.
Well, yeah, I think that the fact that people don't read or can't read long things, they can digest short little, tweets or whatever, and that is the problem, because to do anything substantive, it requires thinking for more than a minute or two, and that's the training that's useful in many ways, and I mean that's part of the training of physics. And speaking of that, I guess I wanted to. Okay, so you were sort of interested in science by reading scientists as young, and your mother encouraged that as well. She didn't want you to be a doctor or anything like that.
No, not like I think your mom wanted you to be a doctor, right? No,
she became a Catholic.
She's one of the rare Jewish mothers, who wasn't like obsessed with me, but she ended up getting a doctor, and my brother's a lawyer, so she got the Jewish mother's dream, right?
Yeah.
I think that the transformative thing that she didn't stand in my way of what I was passionate about. And I was actually pretty motivated. I had a job as a kid. I was stocking shelves in a delicatessen in Dobbs Ferry, New York. And I saved up my money because I really wanted to buy a telescope. And I realized that I always say, like, I'm in no way comparing myself to Galileo, but the mere fact that you can buy a little telescope like this, and I'm going to go into, someday I'm going to start making my own telescopes, because so many people ask me, what should I get I'm just get any sort of telescope. Do not point it at the sun. And anything that you can see is the exact same thing that Galileo saw 400 years ago. All the craters on the moon, all the phases of Venus, the ears of Saturn, as he called them, and most importantly, the moons of Jupiter. And Lawrence, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I've ever said this to you, but I don't think there's a way, as a science, in all of science, that you can replicate the visceral feeling of discovery that you can when you look through a telescope. You can't do it with a Large Hadron Collider in your backyard. You can't do it looking at, with an electron microscope. But if you look through a telescope, you immediately get transformed to the feeling that Galileo had when he looked up. I think that's remarkable. I think it's unparalleled in all of science.
It could be. I mean, there's a difference, of course, that the big difference is that Galileo didn't know what he was going to see. I have a telescope here, which actually I just bought. I had a telescope as a young kid, but I bought a fairly large telescope, which I never bought one when I was living in Arizona, because I live in the city, or when I lived in Oregon, because you couldn't see the sky.
I mean, you could
see the sky, but you couldn't see the stars. But when I moved here, it's just so beautiful. So I knew I'd buy one, and a neighboring kid who's now just gone to university, our next door neighbor, saw me there, and he didn't know, he'd never thought about it, and brought a friend down, and I showed him the moons of Jupiter and also Saturn, and it was just like an awakening experience for them. But the interesting thing is, it's interesting. I first realized this. I remember I was I did some movie about Voyager once, and there was I went to Ireland, I think, and where the director was from, and there was an audience question, and it was only then that I kind of realized something I should have realized before, that every time a young person learns something, for them it's the first time in the history of the world that it's been understood. And this said we should treat it always as discovery rather than regurgitation, and in the sense that it is always brand new. But you're absolutely right that in the telescope it's really visceral, and no matter how many pictures of Saturn you see, when you look at it through the telescope and you say it's there, it still blows me away every time. I look in a telescope.
For me, I bought a little marble notebook, and I taped the pencil inside of it, and I would sketch out the Messier objects, and I was doing research, and I wasn't on this track. As I said, growing up with parents divorced, it was probably traumatic for me. I mean, I always like, people are, one of my sponsors on my podcast was this online therapy company. I won't say the name of it in case you're the sponsors. And I was like, I never really had therapy, I'll give it a try, but I don't endorse things that I haven't used personally. So I started doing it. And I was like, well, what is he going to bring up? I mean, it's so obvious to talk about, parents divorce, et cetera. But really, I'm in my 50s now, or just turned 50 last year. and I started thinking, well, like, is it going to be this Goodwill Hunting moment? I have to like start sobbing over the phone on Zoom on this guy that I've never met, and I feel like those are not really, the cathartic moments, the really, the impactful moments, at least in my life and my career. Mm-hmm. It was these serendipitous things that really came up, and that discovery, and whatever it felt like. Looking back on it makes sense. I was doing scientific research. I didn't know that's what it was.
Yeah.
I had idea. There was no internet in 1986, 87. There was no Google. So you couldn't look these things. So you had to struggle. You had to actually invest some effort. And for my case, that was like the Sunday New York Times had this section, which they no longer do. And it was like the sky at night, basically, Cosmos section. And you could see these. And I was like, holy crap, I saw Venus. Like, I thought you needed to have a spaceship. It was during the Voyager time. Yeah. And that thrill, it's not for everybody, but once that is accessible, you can get teleported away from, I think, a lot of earthly concerns, and then it's kind of a rabbit hole that you just want to go down. And now it's easier than ever. But I wonder, as I said, if that's a good thing. Like the fact that my kid, one of my kids is obsessed with like perpetual motion machines, and he sees something on YouTube and he just gets totally drawn into it. It's great, and he talks about electron plasmas, and he actually had a good suggestion, Lawrence. I want to get you as a particle physicist. He said that the electron really should be called the negatron. I want to start a movement to call the electron the negatron, and the positive.
It's probably a little bit late, but it's not. But it's it's certain. I think if it were logical, of course, if it were logical, it would be called the positron, because it was Ben Franklin who got it wrong. Because really, it's the carrier of electric charge, and that's the one you want to call positive. They just got it wrong, and we're stuck with it now. So tell your son it really should be called the positron, and see what he says.
Okay, that'll be really an upheaval for him. Yeah.
Anyway, so your interest in science came through astronomy, which is a little bit different than me. I had a telescope, but I was kind of interested in lots of things, and I use the telescope part-time to look at the sky. Let me put it that way. But so in school, did you gravitate to science subjects? Did you have good teachers, or?
I did. I went to public schools my whole life. I teach at a public school now. That being said, I think public schools have changed a lot, at least here in the States. But back then, it was wonderful. They had in the library, they had Scientific American, a once great magazine that featured
once great
many of your articles and expository statements. Now I can't really bring myself to read most of it.
Yeah, me too.
But when I looked at when I would go to the library, and really you had to subscribe to these magazines, Sky and Telescope, Astronomy, and I still subscribe to them to this day. For me, that was the entree, and then I had to learn about math. And because I think my lack of influence, my mother totally innumerate, and my father just not being in the picture, and my stepfather being really out to just a workaholic, alcoholic, maybe, and even as well, having to deal with that at home was a big challenge, and feeling like, I wanted to have an escape. And for me, that escape became taking this telescope out. Now, then I realized I need to learn about math, and I wasn't put on the track to learn about math at that age. I was on the track to just to graduate from high school without taking calculus.
Wow.
And so I had to kind of take on myself to learn trigonometry, pre-calculus, and calculus in the span of, only 2.5 years. So I could take the AP exam, and which I did and did well on, and got out of my first, kind of required class at Case Western. So it was really self-motivation, I think, just to learn more. What is parallax? How do we know these stars are that far away? What is redshift? And what can you see through this? I was around Halley's Comet, the last appearance of Halley's Comet. I really wanted to see that. I didn't think I'd be around for the next appearance, and still another 40 years away. So those things to me were, and you're right, most people didn't really care. I mean, if you look at Andromeda through a telescope and you're expecting, like this picture behind me, if you're watching on YouTube, you're going to be disappointed. And I think that's, we never should have launched Hubble, because it makes these pictures too accessible. Or JWST should be canceled for many reasons. So I think but I became kind of like an apologist, Lawrence. I was like, well, you see, there is a smudge there, and if you use averted vision, you can actually see the equatorial bands of Jupiter. And people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, it's just a peach-colored smudge. Yeah, but to me, I knew what I was, the eye that has a brain, as Homer Simpson would say. That was the thing that was so appealing to me. The connecting a hypothesis to an observation, writing in my logbook, and these are, $50, $60. You could do that and make potentially an inroad to a career for a young person.
Okay, well, you're a great advertiser for getting a telescope and thinking about these things, but I'm intrigued. I want to know, why were you drawn to, well, I guess it was astronomy. Why were you drawn to physics rather than did you ever think of doing biology or anything else, or was it always because of astronomy that you wanted to do physics?
Well, you remember at Case there was a Professor Peter Pesch.
Yeah.
And he was a very famous astronomer. He's still alive. I heard some good news about him recently. He's still working, I think. Anyway, he was a friend of another astronomer who was a friend of one of my cousins. And this astronomer's name is Jay Pasachoff, who's very famous. He wrote the Menzel guide after Menzel died at Harvard. Sure. They wrote the Field Guide, Peterson Guide to the Stars and Planets. And that was like my Bible. I read that every night, before I do observations. And so I became friends with Jay Pasachoff, or at least he was friends with my cousin. And he said, Case has a great program, go to Case. So I went to Case. And this was about the time I had worked over the summer. I'd saved up some money working in restaurants in Westchester County. And my stepfather got fired. He was unemployed. So we had just enough money to not qualify for financial aid my freshman year, and I was about to get kicked out of Case Western, but for the generosity of donors and even the president, Agnar Pitta, who you probably remember.
Ag was one of the few good university presidents I've ever known, and one of the few honorable university presidents I've ever known.
Yes, anyway, with courage, which is a very rare trait for university.
He recruited me, so I have a special attraction. Yeah, but anyway,
and he would meet with me. I was some freshman that had a decent GPA, but was going to kick. And
they
said, well, we have this program now.
And a physicist. He was also, go on.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he ended up saying, well, you did so well in your SATs that if you had applied 1 year later, we would have given you a full ride. So he ended up cobbling together a full ride for me one way or another with some loans and support from an alumni. So I ended up still remaining at K, but I figured I need something practical. Astronomy is not practical. It's too much fun. Like, who's going to pay me to do this? It's like being paid to be an ice cream taster or a wizard, one of these roller coaster testers. By the way, if you ever want to see like the definition of jaded, if you come to San Diego SeaWorld at 8:30 in the morning, there's a guy who gets paid to ride the Atlantis roller coaster, which is like one of the most terrifying roller coasters in the world. This guy has to sit in the front seat all by himself for liability reasons. I once brought my binocs there with my kids, and I zoomed in on his face, and he was like this, like going down a 45-degree angle at like 200 miles an hour. I would be like, freak, this guy's so jaded. He does it every day. Anyway,
well, it's the first thing you do at work. It can't be exciting. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So I ended up thinking, well, I need something practical. Let me do engineering. So I switched to civil engineering. I hated it. It was terrible. And then that summer, my stepfather, Ray Keating, again, he gave me some great advice. He said, well, why don't you do something that's like a mixture between practicality and philosophical, kind of intrigue that you're interested in. Physics is a good blend between the two. And so I switched my major to physics, and I never looked back. So I when I went to Brown, I was a physics, PhD. My department is now switching to half astronomy and half physics, but I've been a physicist my whole life.
Well, you indirectly got, I think, the right route. I was going to ask, it intrigued me, I was a professor, obviously I was chair of the physics department, but I was also in the astronomy department there. And Case was one of the few universities that had an undergraduate major in astronomy.
That's right.
And when students ask me who want to be astronomers, and I say, do an undergraduate degree in physics, because that's the right preparation. So I was really intrigued that was your interest in astronomy, but you went through physics, which is exactly the right thing to do, because that's the right background. It used to be, you see, before you were born, maybe, but when you're younger than me, but it used to be that astronomy is quite different. It was kind of like botany in the sense that it sort of was labeling things, and now astronomy has essentially become astrophysics and merged with, and so the distinction between astronomy and physics is very different. But when I first started, it was really a distinction, and it was interesting to me because I I became a professor in both departments from the time I taught at Yale and onward. But I never once took an astronomy course in my life, not once.
Yeah,
But because
I
it was,
didn't either. I didn't,
yeah,
when I'm teaching, I teach astronomy, I teach
yeah,
cosmology. I never
yeah,
took these classes. I took,
yeah. Physics is the
condensed
right
matter physics.
preparation. And
Yeah.
by the way, I also used to, when I was chair at Case, I used to tell the potential engineering students, because Case is primarily an engineering school. I used to tell them that, we created a program in engineering physics, because I used to say that's the best of both worlds, because, you get a physics training and you can become an engineer, and if you really need the job. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but a large fraction of people who are called engineers in industry are actually trained as physicists, so they don't.
Oh yeah, I always say if you want something soldered right,
Yeah.
the last person you call is an electrical engineer.
Yeah.
It's
Anyway,
the most flexible. I have zero unemployment. I've graduated 18 students over the years, and 4 of them are faculty, and not one of them is unemployed. And it's the most flexible job. Some of them work for Amazon.
Sure, it's a great training. Yeah, no, I mean, I've students in all of those. Yeah, so I used to argue when I was recruiting that physics is a great training, but I won't do that recruiting spiel here. But you lucked into the right department, and the physics department at Case was a great department. And when I was very pleased to become chair there, and a long tradition, especially of spending a lot of its energy in undergraduate education. That one of the things that I was very proud of when I was there, but it was a tradition that had been created before I was there, is that we generally tried to put really good teachers, especially at the earlier levels, and not always have sort of lecturers teach the big introductory courses. When I started, there were some, but we moved it away eventually to where we could get our really good faculty, because that's where they really should be, is sort of motivating young people. Anyway, it was nice. You graduated the year I arrived, and so we sort of passed like ships in the night. But and then you, as I say, you went on to that unknown Ivy League university, Brown, I think it's called. Yeah, and anyway. But before we get to your physics career, you did touch on this interesting conversion. You made 2 conversions, religious conversions. You went from being a Catholic to being an atheist, and then sort of from being an atheist to being Jewish. Of course, being Jewish and being an atheist is not inconsistent. But I don't want to dwell on this, but I'm intrigued. What caused you, as someone who had been influenced by people and whoever they were, and maybe was one of them, but I think it's hard to be a scientist and not be an atheist. It's not impossible, because there are a number of good scientists who aren't. But it's never sort of a catharsis. It's usually a small sort of a drift when you begin to realize you don't need the fairy tales, that the real world is pretty interesting without them. But why don't you talk about that? Why you decided to sort of then, if you wish, adopt Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, I think the revelation, if you like to call it that, although it's not meant in this way, was that I had rejected something as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old. And actually, this is the way the syllogism worked for me. I thought I could reject Judaism after rejecting Christianity. In other words, I felt like Christians are very smart, and they're going to know things, and so they must have known what came before them, namely the Old Testament, the Torah, as we call it, and so they must have gone through and reconciled and rectified all the issues and the problems and the flaws, and said, we're going to improve it. So Christianity, in some sense, is Judaism 2.0. This is my logic. And perforce, if I can reject Christianity, then all the more so can I a fortiori, as they say, I could reject Judaism. So I really didn't think about it from the time that I gave up Catholicism, which was mainly due to this absurd treatment of Galileo, which by the 1980s, and in fact, he's never been pardoned formally by the Catholic Church. He was ruled by John Paul, who was a great man, and he ruled that he was correct in 1989, I think it was, in an encyclical, but he never never pardoned him. So I felt in the 1980s when I was like, well, how can I be adhering to something that would torture? I thought they tortured him. Little did I know it. Bernie Madoff would easily, gladly trade the prison cell that he had, for the prison cell that, quote unquote, Galileo had, which I hosted a conference in his villa in Arcetri outside of Florence in 2015 for the 100th centennial of relativity, which of course Galileo started, right? So anyway, it wasn't that bad a place to do your bid.
Galileo's daughter had a much harder time, in fact, than Galileo. But anyway,
yes. both of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but how could I adhere to somebody that tortured this person? And of course, you go through all the things. Well, like, Judaism condones, stoning children and doing this and doing that. But I realized, Lawrence, I really knew nothing about Judaism. I actually knew more about Islam because it was so prominent in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
It was impossible to not be
Yeah.
affected by it. And I knew a lot about Catholicism, Christianity, because I had converted and been baptized, confirmed, and altar boy.
Yeah.
So, but I knew nothing about Judaism. I didn't know how to read Hebrew. I never studied for, all I knew is that on Hanukkah, I used to remember getting a pair of Husky trousers instead of getting, an Atari, or a Commodore 64, so like my Gentile friends. So I felt like it was almost a negative to be associated with Judaism, but I knew nothing about it. And in my 20s, I started to think, well, Judaism sure is playing this big role in an outsized impact on society. And, at least behooves me to learn something about the religion of my birth, even if I will ultimately reject it. But to reject it without any confrontation as an adult. Einstein used to say that he never asked questions like, what would it happen if I traveled at the speed of light and looked in a mirror to his father when he was 5 years old? And it was good that he didn't ask his father that question, because his father would have told him the wrong answer, because it took Einstein, the junior, to actually come with the right answer. So he said it was a blessing that I never asked my father these big questions. And I feel like for me, the richness of Judaism, when all you learn is, like you said, this miserable training for your bar mitzvah and getting embarrassed as your voice cracks on the stage in front of all your friends, and your bubby is going to pinch your cheeks too hard, and you might get some money. Those are very superficial. And I felt like there was a depth to even reading, even as an atheist. I think as an atheist, you can say there is wisdom in traditions that last for thousands of years. There are conflicts, there are challenges. But I think the main thing, so Lawrence, like one thing, that I think is a misconception about Judaism is how much is really present in Judaism in what you and I do, which is cosmology or particle physics. So I once looked at the Torah, the Old Testament, and I looked, how many sentences are there that have anything to do with science in the Torah? Not the Talmud, which is 2,700 pages long, the second, but in the Torah itself. So there's at most 32 verses that have to do with the first 7 days. And by the way, of course, there are things that make no sense scientifically, like the sun was created on the fourth day. What is that? But they're not stupid, right? I know you've called them Bronze Age peasants and stuff, but let's just stipulate that there's.
Well, they weren't stupid; they were just ignorant. That's a big difference.
Of course, but ignorant about science is one thing. If it's a science book, I always say, if I look to A Brief History of Time or the physics of Star Trek, if I look to it like, how am I going to raise my kids? Or how am I going to deal with, peacefulness in my home? Or it's not, you didn't write it for that. I didn't write my books as a guide to how to raise my children or for wisdom that could last, presumably for some time. And so I start to look, well, what are these things like stoning a kid? That's barbaric. That's disgusting. That's preposterous. How could anybody adhere to this? And that's in the Old Testament. That's not some abstract thing that appears in the Talmud.
It's right there.
What was the context of that? So I start to look into it. Well, let me look through the sources of it. So first of all, Jews are incredibly good at documenting and scholastic research, and they had train of custody for all these things going back. There's not one recorded instance where a child was ever killed by his parents in all of recorded case law, which is what the Talmud is. And I said, well, that's interesting. Why would you have a law that has no purpose, that you never did? And I realized, even to this day, Lawrence, there are places in the Middle East, in certain parts of Africa, where kids are killed, and they're killed by their parents. And so it wasn't the parents. The law actually says you will take your kid and you'll bring him to the Sanhedrin, which is the court, and they will stone the kid. Okay, so what did that do? Well, it took the ability to kill children out of parents' hands for the first time. I said, that's pretty interesting. Also, divorce. Divorce was not common.
You're being quite
Women were chattel, as you know, right? They were like chattel, right? They could be bought and sold as slaves, right? So what did Judaism do? So I have a document hanging in my kitchen, which is my prenuptial agreement. And it tells all the obligations that I owe my wife. And if I don't give it, she has to be able to be permitted to marry another man. That was never done in the ancient world. In fact, in this very moment, there aren't people that are subject to basically chattel slavery and so forth. And I started to ask,
of course, you still realize that the fact that there's not a similar document that where you'd be permitted. I mean, the fact that she'd be permitted, many people would say those words are offensive today, but in any case.
But the alternative was I kill her, right?
No, I know, you're absolutely right. It may I think that's the important point. We live in the society nowadays, we're fixated on the fact that people behave badly 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. But you're absolutely right. Compared to the alternative, it was much better. And you can't judge people by modern standards. A century ago, right, or a millennia ago, and that's something I wish young people understood now, but they don't.
Right? No, they want to say that the world started spinning, the day that they were born, and all these people that came before them, if they had one fault. And I'd like to say, well, do you eat meat? Because in 100 years you could be subject to the exact same. Barack Obama eats meat, right? So there's pictures of him eating Five Guys hamburgers, right? Yeah. So is he going to be canceled someday? He could be. And so I feel like that's very dangerous to say that. So when I was a kid, and maybe even before, there was don't trust anyone over 30. Yeah. I trust a book that's 30 centuries old. Like I remember reading, I read, I don't know if you've ever reread Stephen Hawking's books. Of course, you know everything in it, but he talks about inflation as being proven, M theory being proven, and it's a vindication of all his ideas with Hartle. It's all nonsense. And I said to myself, he really would be happy with his books being relevant 100 years from now. Yeah. And I would be terrified if the science that you and I do now and talk about in our works is still like cutting edge and has never been overthrown. That would be very depressing to me. And so I look at, I didn't close the loop on this, like just the accounting. So there's 30 verses out of 30,000 verses in the entire Old Testament, plausibly could say is related to science in some way or another, or cosmology even, or Adam and Eve, whatever. So that's 0.1%, right? So 1 in 1,000. So if you looked at a book and it said, great NBA stars, and you started reading through that book, and 999 of the 1,000 pages were about like the Oliver North trial. And this book is not titled like, it's not correct. Like, this is idiotic. Like I was misled. So I think there is a natural, and people talk about science and religion and conflict. I think that's kind of stupid. I mean, honestly, there are useful things that you can glean. I don't think you can glean any wisdom necessarily from the Feynman lectures. I think you can gain a tremendous amount of knowledge.
I think you can gain some wisdom. I think we disagree. In fact, I would argue get as much wisdom if you read it carefully and critically as you might from the Bible. But anyway.
Well, look at you, Lawrence. I was very touched when you wrote about your mother. Your mother was a tremendous influence on you. You don't write so much about your father. Certainly, I wrote a lot more about my father. But I know that the fifth commandment in this schema of things is honor your parents, honor your father. Actually says it says fear your mother and honor your father, because it's kind of the natural inclination. Like kids kind of
tease their father. I was certainly afraid of my mother. There's no doubt.
Yeah, exactly. And the word is kavod. It means to make heavy. It means to like be in fear and awe and terror. Now, I don't know that the man who treated me the way that my father treated me, if he necessarily deserved the filial devotion that I showed to him in his waning moments of his life, which was strenuous for me and for my older brother. I don't think I would have done that if I didn't feel like there was an injunction in the commandment. Remember, it says, honor your mother and your father so that your days will be long on this earth. Now, what does that mean? That you're going to live longer? I don't think so. I think it means your days will be filled with more life. And I think you honoring your mother the way that you did and you do posthumously, I think your life is improved from that. I think it's inarguable. I think that you being the son, now you could say you didn't need the Bible, but I think, again, you came from a rich tradition of people in our religion. I don't think our religion is better. People argue, the number of Nobel Prize winners. I think that's nonsense. I think it's racist. But there is a tradition related to argumentation. As I said when you were on my podcast, the word Israel means fights against God. It's the exact opposite of Islam. So I feel like that's our tradition. And for me, at least, maybe I'm not as sophisticated as you or something, but I felt like having a code where you're saying from a very early age, putting things in the mouth of your children and teaching to them in a way that they can understand a value system that has a preponderance, in my estimation, of good deeds and goodness on earth. I think it's a good thing. So I use it mainly to answer a long-winded way of answering your question. I view it as practical. It has made my life better to have a code at least to measure and calibrate against, as we do as scientists. You need some standard to compare against, unless you're making it up yourself. I didn't feel I was sophisticated enough to make up my own moral code in my life and my children. So it does provide a useful calibration standpoint.
Sure. Look, my point is that, whatever floats your boat, if, you take it as if religion helps someone, and as long as it doesn't get in the way and lead them to irrational and seemingly evil behavior, I have no problem with it. I also especially have no problem with it if people realize, hey, this is allegory, and as you do, and I mean, there is a real conflict between science and religion in the sense that when there are scientific statements, they're generally wrong in the Bible, but that's okay. Your point, you weren't the first person to point out the Bible isn't a scientific document. St. Augustine certainly did, but so if it works for you, my whole point, however, is, and I'm not sure it's my whole point, but one of the key ideas I like to get across for people is that just like Sam Harris seems to think you need to do psychedelics to understand the world, which is nonsense. You don't. If it works for you, fine, and if it's productive and leads to good behavior, great. But you don't need it. You don't need it to be moral. You don't need it to lead a good life. You don't need it to come to moral conclusions. And that's the biggest problem with religion, is that it's kind of usurped or monopolized morality, that it's viewed in a modern society. If you're not religious,
I just don't want to conflate, like fatwas and coercive Islamist, in Judaism, as you may know, it's forbidden to proselytize. I mean, that's one, and it was forbidden from the Romans by force, but nowadays it's not we're not forbidden I can, reconvert you back to Judaism. I could do that and then be perfectly legal in America. But we don't do it. In fact, you're supposed to turn away converts. A lot of converts, women convert to marry Jewish men and vice versa. Although it's a little more rare. You're actually supposed to be turned away. You're actually supposed to be turned away.
I think you're proselytizing right now. So we'll go to another area. Anyway, it was nice. It was interesting to see what your rationale is. And my brother happens to be a very religious Jew. So these conversations are not new to me. I don't quite You talked about the wisdom of ancient books, and there is some wisdom, but most ancient books, I tend to think we've actually progressed even in our wisdom compared to back then, and therefore I tend to, although I'm an avid student of history and I love ancient history and I used to read it. And by the way, when I was younger, I read all the religious books because I just read everything. But I don't think we have to. I think it's again a worry when people say the wisdom of the ancients, because they seem to think that it's all there. But I think that we've discovered a lot of wisdom in the ancients.
I look here. Here's just one last example, and you'll cut me off if I'm proselytizing. In the Bible, there's no positive stories of family dynamics in the entire book of Genesis. There's not one story of a loving husband and a wife. Now, why is that? Should most religious texts start off with the godly nature of their progenitors, right? Even in Christianity, right?
Not in ancient Roman and Greek history. They had great gods because those gods were just behaved like humans and they were pretty vicious.
Right. They would have all these foibles. And so what meant to teach? Well, most families, as Tolstoy said, right, all unhappy families are miserable in their own ways. But I think it's part of the human condition that you didn't have to be. You could achieve greatness if your brothers tried to kill you, if your sons tried to deceive you. These are things that happen. And I look at the Tower of Babel story now, Lawrence. I see so many parallels. I'm not literal, but like with people rewriting language and using language as weapons, physical weapons. And what is the reason that they say? They wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to take down God. Okay, so that's a allegory, but they wanted to do it to make a name they want to build a tower out of composite materials so that they could make a name. And then what does God do? He disperses them and confuses them, and their language is dispersed. So now they're going to be talking in gobbledygook. I see so much of that as relevant today, at least from my perspective on a college campus. There's so much newspeak going on right now. I don't think even the Bible comes close to covering.
Well, there you go. You just point out another reason why God is no one to be worshipped, because God wanted to get in the way of knowledge and make a name for humans, to make a name for themselves, in my opinion. But in any case, so look, you can extract wisdom And there I extract wisdom in some of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. Wherever you get it, it's fine. Whatever literature, or whatever you look, and the Bible is literature, and it reflects a perception as its time. And I read it when I read it. I read it. I think, well, I was curious more than knowledgeable. But if I were going to read it again, it's sort of a reflection of its time, and therefore I find it fascinating to see what humans were thinking about. Just like, as I said, just like I happen to have Plutarch's Lives down here, and I love to read them every now and then, because seeing both the continuity of thought and the difference in thought is fascinating for me. So anyway,
I think it is. The last thing I would say, Lawrence, and I know you do, I want to move on too, but I think it would be fascinating, because I do see you. I know you call yourself a militant atheist, but
no, I don't. Not anymore. I call myself an apatheist.
Okay, you used to.
Yeah, I used to, because my friends. Yeah, but I think now I'm more, because I'm an apatheist, because I don't think God's relevant to anything. But anyway, go on.
Okay. But no, I think there is a virtue in, so there's something called the Havrusa, or partner method of studying, where two people sit down and we just go back and forth. And these commentaries go back thousands of years. Like you said, we're not going to be the first ones, but we're going to approach it from a specific point of view. And I have had, kind of, at least from a purely, you can take it purely literarily, but going through stories, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, these are obviously very rich and impactful on Western civilization. But I even think that they'd be interesting to you, not just from like, oh, I'm going to study like sociology of the world and world history, but actually going through it and saying like, well, what does it mean when the serpent like says, did God really say you couldn't touch the tree? Oh, no. Eve says, oh, no. And then the woman that you gave me, like, told me to eat the tree. No, she didn't do that. Like, and obviously they knew that there were these contradictions. I mean, they're not stupid, as you have said. They're not stupid. They just knew what their time. They're ignorant of scientific. Okay, fine. I'm just saying, I would love someday to do this Havrusa Talmudic description, because I think it would enrich, as it enrich my life. Not trying to convert or proselytize, but I do think it would be, to see the modern resonances. I think it would be fun. It would at least be fun. That's all I
think it'd be fun. But my point is, it'd be fun with almost any ancient book or any modern book to do the same thing. So there you go. I mean, I would love to talk about Catch-22 with you, which I think is a much more motivating and much more, had a book that had much more impact on me than the Bible. But in any case, but no, look, this was an interesting, and I appreciate your discussion in this regard. But let's go from the ridiculous to the sublime. And talk about physics, and I want to. And so you went to do your PhD in physics, but you started your PhDs in the cosmic microwave background, which has been the area of research for your whole career. What was that? Just an accident of who happened to be a good supervisor, Peter Timby, I guess, at Brown, or did you think about that? I mean, clearly it merged your interests in the sense that it was physics, but it was applied to astronomy in a sense. So what caused you to get interested in the CMB? Cosmic microwave background, I should say, for those.
Yeah. So I always wanted to like tinker and like build stuff. I had an old Volkswagen, I used to take it apart and put it back together. So I always like working with my hands. I knew I probably didn't get started early enough in my math education to really go into theoretical physics, although it's always interested me, and I continue to try to maintain at least a conversant nature with theory, although I don't do new theories, novel theories, but I pride myself that I know a lot more about theory than many of my experimental colleagues. And I wanted to do something, impactful. And it was right after, and when I started graduate school, it was right after Kobe released their results in 1992. It was a year after that. And and I started at Brown there was a young professor there, just come from Princeton, where a lot of Kobe had been designed by David Wilkinson, who was my grand advisor. It was his PhD advisor. And we hit it off. He was very young and energetic, and he had made the first proposal to go after the polarization of the microwave background. People hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, it was early on. No one was talking about it at the time. At least few people.
That's right. Yeah. And so I got connected with him, and he also was somehow he got connected with a student of the great Yakov Zel'dovich. It was a Russian scientist who had emigrated to the UK named Alexander Polnareff. And Polnareff had made some of the first predictions about what gravitational waves would do to the cosmic microwave background's polarization. So this is way before we even discovered that the CMB was definitively polarized.
Yeah.
And so I thought this was so exciting. And it was before we really had an inkling that inflation, the primordial epoch of hyper-accelerated expansion, could impact the cosmic microwave background with a particular class of polarization categorized as now called B-mode polarization. Yeah. So it was long before that, but I found it so fascinating that you could actually measure with a radio telescope that we could build on the roof of the Barris and Holly building at Brown, and we could actually set some limits or maybe even make a detection. And lo and behold, this became my thesis project, looking for the large angular scale polarization of the microwave background. I even spent a couple of months with Alexander Polnareff in Queen Mary, and we did the first modern treatment of what the expectation would be for the polarization of the microwave background in 1995. And we made predictions what we'd see if there were gravitational waves, if there was reionization, which was still, kind of unexpected at that time. And so it's fascinating to me that you could use a small radio telescope, a couple $100,000 project, and make a deep impact, especially right after Kobe had done this, really, really incredible work detecting for the very first time using the exact same technology that I was using, except mine was polarized, highly polarized, sensitive. We could maybe make a detection maybe as big as what Kobe had discovered. And of course, we're still waiting in some sense to make those detections. But the stakes have grown ever higher in this field, just kind of paying out like a Stockholm slot machine with Nobel Prizes. And that
I wondered how long it would take you to get. I wondered how long it would take you the word Nobel Prize, because you're fixated.
Yeah, right. Well,
but we'll talk about that later. I keep trying to get you over this fixation with that. But anyway, I want to parse this more carefully, because this, to me, this is obviously an important area. It's obviously personally important to me, and it's kind of fascinating to me when I think about you having left Case right around that time. And when I moved to Case, I had just I'd been fascinated by Kobe. In fact, had been tried when I taught at Yale to get Yale to hire George Smoot, but I couldn't convince them to do it. But and ran the first workshop that brought together theorists and experimentalists on the cosmic microwave background when I was at Yale. They didn't used to talk to each other. And then that was the workshop where they decided to start doing things in multiple moments and developing a term. The question is, what could you measure? See, no measurements have been made. So what could you measure that you could interpret in terms of theory? And it was a fascinating meeting. And Dick Bond was there. And so for me, as a wasn't my main area, but the need to bring theorists and experimentalists together was so ripe, because the minute you did get a measurement, it didn't mean anything unless you could sort of say how you could compare things with theory. And it was fascinating to watch. And I obviously I was interested in inflation, so we just around then wrote papers, but never thinking of polarization, but how to distinguish inflation from other things. And I worked on with my student Martin White at the time a bunch of things. But I want to take it back, because I want to. What I was working on is irrelevant. I want people to be able to understand what the significance of this is. So we have to take people back, and I want to parse a little more carefully, because polarization, the experiments you were doing and are still involved in, could be obviously incredibly important. As you know, I was actually on your BICEP experiment. As you know, I was asked to write the companion sort of paper talking about its significance. So I want to get people to where BICEP was and what it did and what it didn't do, and why it was interesting. So let's step back a little bit. So the cosmic microwave background is as I'm sure I've talked about in this and before, but it's probably worth talking about again, is a signal of what the universe looked like when it was about 300,000 years old. It's the most direct bit of data that, as again, I've also said, and other people, but it turned cosmology from an art into a science. When I was back when I taught it, when you were an undergraduate, when I was at Case, and even that, and at Yale before that, was convinced you'd never be able to measure any fundamental cosmological quantities, that astrophysics would get in the way. And the cosmic microwave background changed that, because it's a direct signal. So why don't you talk a little bit about it, you, the experimentalist?
Yeah, so I think that is the important thing. People don't really realize that you can do experiments in cosmology, because we typically think of experiments as having a control and then modifying some variable, and then you get the impact of the output. But of course, with even astronomical objects, you can't change the temperature of the sun very easily, or change the cross section of the neutrons inside of the sun. So how do you do an experiment? And especially when you only have one thing, or at least when I was a kid, we thought there was only one universe. That's what uni means, right? Yeah. So the conception of the CMB was fascinating to me, that you could build an instrument, effectively a radio telescope, that sees the microwave wavelength radiation, which is the fossil relic heat, the oldest heat or radiation in the universe. That's the leftover, schmutz that comes from the fusion of the lightest elements in the periodic table, and lasted for at least 371,000 years, when the universe was basically a plasma of protons and electrons, and none of my favorite croutons floating around. But it was very, very simple physics, which is very useful for physicists to make predictions. A plasma, fourth state of matter, sometimes it's called, and its properties are very, very simple and easy to predict in a certain sense, acting under the force of gravity with a certain amount of dark matter. And people don't usually realize that dark matter's first evidence that was really quantitative, as Lawrence said, as a science, was coming from the fluctuations in the CMB and their magnitude, not only from rotation curves of galaxies. So there's very simple ingredients: dark matter, two different types of ordinary matter, and photons. That's all you need to make this leftover signal, which was detected by Penzias and Wilson, 1965. Serendipitously, they weren't looking for it; they found it by accident. And those discoveries, I claim, are the purest and most important in scientific history, and that was certainly one of them. Another one was dark energy, which you, of course, were intimately involved with, at least in the theoretical side of things. But anyway, so this plasma is very simple. So you want to mine, scientists are simple-minded people. We want to mine as much as we can from as little input information as possible, and make as many predictions about what you'd see. So these fluctuations also can imprint. When light interacts with matter, it can become polarized, which means that it'll have a preferential axis of orientation or oscillation. Waves of electromagnetic character have a polarization, which is the plane of oscillation. So if you're watching this on YouTube, I've got a polarizer here. It's reflecting my camera. I've got another one here, and I can rotate them at right angles to each other, and one will completely obscure what the other one is transmitting, and it will go through alternating cycles every 90 degrees. There's 90 degrees, it becomes completely opaque, and then it goes another 90 degrees, 180, it goes back to being transparent. That is the sine qua non of polarization. And it's what allows us to build effectively polarizing sunglasses, but for microwaves. Yeah. And they allow us to look into the CMB and see the subtle imprint of the interaction of light with matter. So the river behind you has a glare, because there's sunlight striking it, and it's reflecting some of the polarization, and it's absorbing some of the polarization as well. That's why when you go out on the river, you bring polarized sunglasses.
When I go fishing, I have polarized, so you can see under the water.
Yeah. So that removes the glare, which now your eye has more sensitive contrast, and it can see into the water. That's exactly why we use polarized sunglasses. So what's the lesson? Polarization is a tracer of the scattering of unpolarized light, in this case from the sun hitting the river, off of matter, in that case the water, the dielectric material water behind you. The same thing can happen in a plasma in the early universe, and instead of tracing the distribution of where the sun is and how bright the sun is, it's tracing the fundamental composition of the matter, the electrons, the protons, and the dark matter, and the properties of potentially other forms of radiation, in this case gravitational waves, which could be suffusing the early universe at the same time that the CMB is produced. That's what we're looking for, those telltale interactions.
And for me, and to add, that was a beautiful description, and it's an incredibly important probe, and the fact that you can do it still amazes me. I'm always amazed by what experimentalists and observers can do, especially since I usually underestimate them. It just seems so difficult. But for me as a theorist, what was most interesting was not just the fact that, if astrophysics involves a lot of dirty stuff, and sure, the light can interact with matter, and you learn a great deal about astrophysical environments, but as someone who was a particle physicist and was sort of interested in fundamental things, what amazed me early on was that it could not just end up being polarized, but it could start out being polarized because it could have been created in a way that because of properties of what happened in the early universe with inflation. And in fact, I don't know if I ever talked about this, but the first paper, because my student Martin and White and I were thinking about these things, about how you could probe stuff. When COBE first came out, COBE, as you know, measured actually what we call the quadrupole anisotropy. That is sort of there's north, south, east, and west, and you could sort of compare the east-west anisotropy of the microwave background with the north-south, if you want to think of it that way. And having already been thinking about gravitational waves, the paper we wrote showed at the time that you could explain the entire COBE signal as a quadrupole signal from gravitational waves, and we worked it out what the scale of inflation would be, and it was what the scale of inflation we thought was reasonable at the time, and it's funny because up to that point no one, I think, had been thinking about whether the gravitational waves could give a signal on the microwave background, but it could, but because gravitational waves are what are called basically quadrupole waves. There's two things they can do. They can imprint directly a quadrupole anisotropy, and so that's what we looked at. Or the other alternative is they can produce a polarization signal that reflects that quadrupole anisotropy. And it took a while later when people said, hey, maybe you could try and measure that directly and see gravitational waves from the beginning of time, which I think is what the BICEP experiment that you eventually became involved in was aimed to do. It was not so much to look at the scattering of light off matter, but to try and look for these primordial modes, which would be the first really direct signature of something that happened almost at the begining of time. And that's for me the most exciting thing. And
because light, or gravitational wave, any form of radiation, as you know, but for your listeners and my listeners, they'll be tuning into this, as the universe expands, all wavelengths and all forms of radiation dilute as a very steep power of the expansion or scale factor, the fourth power. They expand, their number density decreases as the universe doubles in size, the volume goes up by 8. So their number density goes down by 8. So that's 3 powers of the expansion. But also their wavelength gets lengthened, and therefore their energy goes down by another power of the scale factor. So it actually dilutes as the fourth power. That means if you were trying to measure these waves of gravity from the earliest epoch of the universe's history called inflation, if inflation exists, and there's a huge debate right now, it's getting resuscitated and maybe we'll get into that, alternatives to inflation. Sorry. that expansion factor would be 1 trillion times, 1,000 to the fourth power harder to measure today. So I start to realize in early 2000, along with your late friend and my great mentor, Andrew Lang, another father figure in my life. So this is a story of, father figures is maybe the right title for this episode. So he came into my life at a very propitious time for me, that he believed in me. He was at Caltech, a wonderkind.
And he was wonderkind. You were a postdoc there at that time. So he was a postdoc for him. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd been fired from my first postdoc at Stanford University, where I was working for Sarah Church, who was a professor there. I like to say Galileo and I both got fired by the church. But she did me a huge solid favor by getting me in touch with her former postdoc mentor, was Andrew Lang, and I accepted the job offer before the words came out of his mouth. And I realized how privileged I was to get to work with him. And this is right after the boomerang experiment, which you wrote about, in A Universe from Nothing, and other projects you've worked on. And his, he was basically short track for a Nobel Prize. In fact, his wife, his ex-wife, widow, won the Nobel Prize in 2018 in chemistry. But for the chance to work with this great mentor who had just come off the spectacular achievement, along with Paolo Di Bernardis and my colleague Paul Richards, to measure the fluctuations, the anisotropy in the microwave background, definitively, after my colleague Lyman Page and Amber Miller and Mark Devlin had measured it with the TOCO experiment, they had hints, and Boomerang and Maxima came out. There's a revolution in the spring of 2000 rather, 22 years ago. And then to get a job offer to work with him was just spectacular. And he and David Baltimore, who is the president at Caltech, another president with vision, decided that they would back this idea that I had come up with on the tennis courts with my colleague Jamie Bach. And that was to build a refracting telescope, not unlike this glass refracting telescope here, except one that had, instead of retinal cells attached to it, superconducting bolometers or semiconductor bolometers, depending on the incarnation. And we built this experiment called BICEP, which is just a 30 centimeter diameter primary aperture lens. And we took it down to the South Pole, where we had had a base, and we've had a base there for 65 years or so, at the very bottom of the world, which happens to be the driest, highest continent on Earth. And why is that important? Well, in the atmosphere, there are water molecules over every part of the Earth, and water is a very efficient absorber of microwaves, as anyone who's ever heated something up knows, in an oven. So you'd like to be in space, but space costs 100 or 1,000 times more expensive than doing an equivalent experiment on the ground. And with polarization learns, you can do an experiment on the ground almost as well as you can from space. In some ways better, because you can't launch our current experiment called the Simons Observatory has a 6-meter diameter primary mirror, which is bigger than the JWST. So you can, and that had to be origami unfolded in space. We couldn't do that for less than tens of billions of dollars. We can do it in Chile for a mere $100 million. So that's quite exciting. So there are things you can do on Earth that you can't do in space. And the penalty you pay is you get excess emission from our atmosphere that's unpolarized, thankfully. But it makes the experiment take longer. But my colleagues at Princeton and Penn and Berkeley are so exquisitely ingenious at making detectors that we can basically carpet a 6-meter diameter cryostat filled with detectors at 0.1 degree above absolute zero. And we believe we can go after these signals with unprecedented accuracy in just the next 2 years. We get first light in April of 2024.
Okay, well, and the fact that you know you're at the right place, and that Andrew was interested in the idea of polarization, which, you know, again, you were at the right place. You've done that as a graduate student, and trying and you know, BICEP, for people who weren't around, and one of the most exciting moments was when I heard the rumors, and then I got contacted by one of the heads of BICEP to read the paper before it came out, so that I could write a companion paper for the American Physical Society associated with Physical Review. Was this amazing? For me, was an amazing, remarkable discovery, and the greatest surprise that it claimed to measure these primordial waves from inflation, which would change everything. It would be the first direct observable of what happened at the beginning of time, and it was incredibly exciting. And it was unveiled in an incredibly exciting way. And it's gotten a lot of bad press as if they did something wrong, but I still don't. I think they were pretty careful about, they just didn't, they had no, it was not that they misquoted what they did. It was that they weren't aware of a source of noise, and nor did they expect there to be at least, maybe you can correct me, but as far as I can tell, nor did anyone necessarily expect there to be noise that could mimic the signal that they saw. And it was only later that so why don't you take us through that unfortunate episode? And I don't mean unfortunate, in my opinion, they did everything right, except they just didn't realize that there was another source of.
Yeah, we didn't make a blunder. So you know, I was involved. So what happened was I invented BICEP 1, which we later called BICEP 1, and it was an acronym that stood for Background Imager of Cosmic Extragalactic Polarization. And just like your iPhone, every couple of years you upgrade the number of megapixels it has and so forth. And so we upgraded it from 49 detectors to 256 detectors by making transition from the detectors that were made of little semiconductor chips up into superconducting chips. And these superconducting chips are not more sensitive, but they're easier to fabricate. They're all what's called lithographed, like in an Intel or Apple semiconductor fabrication. They can all be made in a planar array. And so they're functionally as sensitive, but they can be mass produced. And because you win not as the number of detectors, but as the square root of the number of detectors. If you quadruple the number of detectors, you only reduce the sensitivity or improve it by a factor of 2. So we went from 49, call it 50, to 250. So we had a factor of square root of 5 improvement by making what was called BICEP 2. Everything else was the same. Same telescope optics, same cryogenics, same location, same observing patch on the sky. And we had known from a very long time, and this was Andrew's philosophy, Andrew Lang, that we would observe until we saw something. And then once we saw something, we'd go back and see what it was. And BICEP 2 had an Achilles heel, which is that it only observed at one frequency.
Yeah.
And that's fine if you only have one unknown, which is the CMB itself. Or if you can convince yourself that the CMB is the only signal that you're seeing. As soon as you add in another signal, be it contamination from the atmosphere, say, which we could rule out, or from the galaxy that we're inhabiting, we are peering out through a galaxy that's a bubbling, in Lawrence Krauss's words, a bubbling bitch's brew, protons, electrons, synchrotron radiation, dust particles, and everything else. And by the way, Lawrence, I want to give a special offer to your podcast listeners. If they subscribe to my mailing list, which is briankeating.com, I will send them, if they're in the US, I'm sorry, I can't send it to dangerous locations like Canada. But if you'll subscribe, I will send you the villain of my book, which is this little piece of space schmutz, which is not focusing. It's a meteorite. Okay. This is an honest to goodness iron nickel meteorite, which I have acquired the old fashioned way
by
eBay, but I will delivered by gravity and the US Postal Service. I will send you the villain that covers the dust jacket of my book, Losing the Nobel Prize. And this was the contaminant. This is the actual signal that we saw. So we saw the impact of trillions and trillions of tons of microscopic grains of mostly magnetized dust particles, which are the result of a failed star or exploded star in our galaxy. So it was an astrophysical signal. It was not a cosmological signal. It does not represent the primordial gravitational wave signal that we were looking for, because it emits at much higher temperature. These grains of dust are 10 times hotter than the CMB, which means that they're 10 to the 4th times hotter in terms of radiation emissivity than the CMB. So we were doomed unless we had a way of removing both the dust and measuring the cosmic signals, and then we could subtract the dust only signal from the dust plus cosmic signal, and we'd be left with the cosmic signal. Now, the failure that I think the team had is that we only went to esteemed readers like you. We didn't actually solicit and I wasn't involved with this. This is John Kovacs.
I interacted with people at Harvard, John Kovacs.
That's right. And so they were interviewing, and Mark Kaminkowski was at the press conference. There wasn't a single member of an experimental team. And there were many that would have been happy to look at it. And there was huge rivalries, and I can understand, but I wasn't involved with that. By the time Andrew died, and he took his own life. He died by suicide, as they say. Just a few months, Lawrence, I don't know if you remember, it's a few months after BICEP 2 was fielded. So he never got to see, and maybe not, things could have been different. Some say it could have been, but his philosophy was we would keep studying until we could say for sure what it was, but he never thought we'd see anything, let alone a signal representing as energetic an epoch of inflation that we claimed on March 17, 2014 to have witnessed. So again, we didn't make, and there were many of us who knew. In fact, we tried to get as much data from that was publicly available, including a famous example where we scraped a PDF slide that the Planck team had put on their website. I'm not intending it for any quantitative research. We quoted that in the first paper, which, by the way, was submitted to PRL, Phys Rev Letters, one of the most prestigious journals, and it wasn't refereed by the time of the press conference. So there were a lot of things we could have done different. And why were we doing that? In my opinion, we were worried about getting scooped. We had been told by people like George Efstadiou and others on the Planck team that this was well within their reach. If we could see it, $1 billion project like Planck could have seen it as well. So these leadership, which I wasn't a member of, decided we're going to go forward. We're going to have a press conference. We're going to put the paper on the archive, and people can investigate it. And almost immediately, there started to be questions of all different types, some legitimate, some not, that we had made a mistake, not a blunder, not leaving the lens cap on or not plugging in the fiber optic cable and thinking we saw a faster than light neutrino. There are many. And in fact, the biggest proof of that, Lawrence, is that the experiment has gone through 2 more generations after BICEP 2, still going right now.
Yeah.
And in fact, is currently the world leader in limits, not measurements, but limits on the microwave background's intensity of beam mode polarization. And it's going to be a while before myself and my teammates on Simon's Observatory come anywhere close to what the BICEP team, which I'm no longer involved with, by the way. I'm still friendly with the leaders, but I'm not. I'm 100% dedicated to the Simon's Observatory right now. So we have long hill to climb to get to where they are. But effectively, what was measured so far, we can't say with any confidence that we have any evidence for inflationary gravitational waves, which makes some people in the theoretical community quite happy because they don't believe inflation actually occurred.
Well, it's first of all, let me parse it as a theorist first. I watched it from a different perspective. Let me say there was another. First of all, no one doubts. I mean, the signal that you claim to see was a signal. It just wasn't a signal of what you thought it was. I think it's fair to say, as a theorist, but also it was an unlucky circumstance because there could have been other directions that your experiment could have looked at where the dust signal would have been much, much smaller. It was an unfortunate circumstance that you happen to look in a direction where the dust was larger. And I think it's a priori until your competition, the Planck satellite, measured what they did. I think many people would have thought that maybe the dust hadn't been as significant. So I think it was not an unreasonable expectation that dust wasn't going to be a problem. At least that's my perspective in retrospect.
Yeah. One of my students picked this patch based on existing evidence from WMAP back in the BICEP 1 era, that this was the least contaminated patch we could look at. But fundamentally, the Achilles heel was that we only had one frequency
and you could
internally.
Whereas Planck could do more. But the other thing, by the way, and this may be new to you because you were watching for distance, but it's another. So you rush to announce because you're worried you're going to be scooped. It's part of the sociology of modern science. The interesting bit of sociology that I don't know if I've ever talked about, but it's another bit of sociology, was the journal rushing. Because I remember getting contacted by, I was actually not John Kovacs initially who contacted me. It was the Physical Review Letters who contacted me and said, hey, we've got this discovery paper. We'd like you to write a companion paper to explain it. And they were so excited by, it could have been submitted to Nature. It could have been submitted to anywhere else. They wanted to push it very hard. And in fact, I think it was the first, I do believe it was probably the first Phys Review Letters paper that violated the 4-page limit.
Yeah.
They allowed it to be as long as possible. And I was just shocked. But it was because they were so excited that they were going to have what they thought of as a Nobel Prize winning discovery in their journal as opposed to another journal. And therefore they pushed it into as very much as well as anyone else, which is another unfortunate characteristic, I guess, about the modern sociology of things, is that journals are competing against each other just like experimentalists are. And they wanted to promote it. And that, as I say, that's how I first found out about it. And they were willing to make it arbitrarily long paper. It's called Letters because it used to be required to have to do 4 pages. And as someone who used to publish in that journal a lot since I was a graduate student, the hard part was you used to have to, there were 3 requirements: timely, important, and also, short. And the hard part was often short and getting things into 4. And so it's very jealous to see that you guys could have as long as you wanted. But in any case, it was not an unrealistic expectation, and it was unfortunate. But indeed, it turned out to be a signal of something other than what you've seen. And then the question is, can you push the limits down? And BICEP has done it. And I have to say that again, as a theorist, one of the smoking guns that made people worried is that the signal was about as large that you claim to see, was about as large as you could possibly imagine a signal being. Whereas you might have expected inflation, which produces these primordial modes. In fact, that's why it's such a good. Inflation is basically the only producer of these kind of modes. Inflation can explain many other things about the observed universe, and it does. But it could have. There are other things that might. But
even before the paper was put on the archive, that Monday and Tuesday of 2014. There were 300 papers about, this is evidence for string gas cosmology by my former teacher Robert Brandenberger, all the way Katie Fries. This is evidence for for power law, inflation, and but I mean, I think you're maybe overestimating the creativity of your fellow theorists.
Oh, no, they can, no, but what I'm saying, it's the only first principles. I mean, it's a generic feature of inflation that you'd look for this, and
that's right.
And you can measure it.
Components, and the thing that I like about this test, and I'm very good friends with the arch, kind of rival theory to this, which goes by the name now cyclic or bouncing cosmologies.
I wouldn't call it a rival. I think that's unfair to the word rival. But anyway, go on. It's another theory which is held by about 4 physicists as opposed to maybe the one that's held by 20,000 or so. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to appeal to authority, right? I mean,
I want to appeal to it, but
Bible, Lawrence,
No, but the difference is, and I've talked to Roger Penrose and Al Guth about this, is that one relies on well-established physics, and one relies on extrapolating what we know, and it's so one makes definitive predictions based on physics that you can trust, and the other one requires you to say, well, okay, maybe this happens and maybe this happens. But anyway, go on.
Right. I think there is a virtue. Well, first of all, let me say 2 things. Sociologically, it's good when there are rivals. And
sure.
I think to say, I mean, I personally agree about Roger's theory. I think the modern bouncing or cosmological models, that there is a virtue, of course, that these things avoid singularities. And I think the failure and the dream of what I'm doing, my job depends on it, as Upton Sinclair would say, and might make me prone to want to accept the inflation occurring in younger, more frivolous days. And now I think I've gotten a little more grizzled about it. But to say that you have a rival that predicts the opposite of what this theory predicts is extremely valuable, because you kill so many different competitors if you make this one. That's the definition of a crisp measurement. Now, where I also make fellow traveling with the alternatives is this multiverse issue. And that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I mean, it's almost become like Holocaust denial, and in fact, people have used this term, multiverse deniers, to talk about those that are skeptical or find difficulty in this notion, which we should probably explain for the listeners, might be so concomitant with inflation in Alan Guth's mind, in Andre Linde's mind, and even in the competitors, is that the multiverse, this chaotic runaway kind of profligate universe, is going to be a feature of inflationary universes. It's almost impossible not to have, you have to suppress multiverse phenomena.
You create many different, just let me parse it for people. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about multiverse in this podcast before, but for people who haven't heard of that, the multiverse in this case is simply regions that are causally disconnected. They're so far apart that they can never communicate. And it's possible the laws of physics could be different in each one. And inflation generically predicts, inflation is generically eternal, and it says most of space is actually very different than the universe we see. And within that very different space, other universes could be being born or dying. And if you wait long enough, there'll be ultimately an infinite number, because it'll go on forever. So that's the idea of a multiverse. There are different versions of multiverses, but that's the most sensible kind of multiverse. So just regions that we can never see, and which it's possible in inflation that where there are seeds of new universes, the laws of physics could be different in those different seeds. Sorry, go on.
And my question to you, because I have you on the line, is why would it only be the laws of physics? In other words, why wouldn't modus tollens not hold in universe 442 next door to ours? In other words, why is only restricted? It seems pretty arbitrary to say, well, only the speed of light would be different, or only the Newton's constant would be different. Could the laws of logic or even math be different in another universe, in the multiverse paradigm?
Well, of course, asking that, we only have math as a language, but the nice thing about inflation is, because it isn't hand waving in that sense, is that it tells you specifically the kind of different possibilities that exist in different multiverses, in different universes. It tells you that each universe is describable by the same physical theory, and how it relaxes in different ways will lead to different physical constants. But once you give up, you might ask, well, is quantum mechanics generic to all of them? And then the answer is, well, if it isn't, then the whole used quantum mechanics to calculate it. So if it isn't, then the calculation doesn't make sense. So as a theorist, it's like you work with what you have. If you're drunk, you won't get under the light, and so this allows real calculations to be done and can be compared to experiment, and it predicts a certain subset of possibilities. Not anything is possible, which unfortunately I just read someone say that quantum mechanics allows anything to be possible. It doesn't, and quite importantly, it doesn't. And so what's nice is, in fact, that's one of the virtues of inflation. It explains precisely the kind of differences that can happen, which might, if the multiverse is real, allow you to probe for those differences in one ways or another. So that's what I like about inflation. It's quite restrictive in the sense of what it allows. I mean, it still allows a lot of possibilities. But
is there an easy way to understand why, say, if the landscape, which is an allied concomitant description that some say is relevant, pertinent to inflation. So when they talk about this 10 to the 500 different vacuum states, is it clear to you, or can you explain to me, how could it manifest as a change in the speed of light? Like if I change the vacuum state here, it's immeasurable, right? And it's not something we have access to the absolute value of the vacuum or ground state. So how is it that changing the ground state in universe 42, again, how does that couple to the speed of light, the vacuum state?
Well, it does, because the ground state determines the relevant forces that are relevant at low energies. Okay, and the speed of light is determined by two fundamental constants in nature: the strength of magnetism, the strength of electricity, and it's because at low energies that electromagnetism manifests as a force because the photon is massless. But you could imagine a vacuum which electromagnetism might not be the sole low energy force, and then the relationship between electricity and magnetism would be different, and that would produce a different speed of light. So it's just precisely the fact that those fundamental constants are reflected in what forces are manifest at low energies, and that's a property of the vacuum. And different vacua would allow different forces to potentially be manifest. And in fact, it would make the masses of particles different, as well as it. In fact, most importantly, you could imagine a vacuum where the light isn't massless, which of course would be a very different world. But you could certainly imagine a vacuum where the photon is not massless, and that would be, of course, then the photon wouldn't have the speed of light, and it'd be very different laws of physics. So that's precisely the relationship between the vacuum and the speed of light. No, it's good. I was going to ask you to ask me questions, so this is a good.
Yeah.
But
now that since you're asking, you wrote a paper with Wilczek, which I think you won a gravity prize about quantum mechanics and the B mode, the gravitational wave imprint that I study and we claim detection of. And the challenge I always have is, when I think quantum, I mean, I'm an experiment. I'm just a simple, humble experimentalist, right, Lawrence?
Yeah.
So I think of the double slit experiment. I would want that to be kind of the sine qua non of quantum gravity. I often hear that if we detect, B modes, will we have detected the inflationary epoch and the multiverse, but it'll be the first evidence for quantum gravity.
Well, that's what we demonstrated.
But if I observe right now, I'm seeing these photons, and let's say I have a Michelson interferometer done at Case Western, right? And I measure the wavelength, and I have a classical wave, and that's all that these waves are when they imprint the CMB at 371,000 years post Big Bang. So how is that evidence for quantum nature of gravitons?
So that's why it was so surprising to us, and I was so excited about it when I first kind of recognized it. But the simple argument is that it turns out that in order for inflation, everything we see, galaxies are classical objects, but you know that they come in inflation from originally quantum fluctuations.
Yeah.
And it turns out that what we're able to show is that lumps of matter are very classical, but they originated as quantum fluctuations in inflation. And what we're able to show is that if and only if there were quantum fluctuations in the gravitational field, would you produce a remnant classical distortion in space and time? Just like, and we showed basically if quantum mechanics wasn't true, namely if electrons didn't interfere with other electrons, which would happen if Planck's constant went to zero, then if Planck's constant went to zero, there will be no gravitational wave spectrum from inflation. Basically, that's what we're able to show mathematically. And so we basically are able to show in a very, actually, in the best of all possible ways. I showed it quite in a complicated mathematical calculation, but then one of the things that Frank did was to show, okay, using what we call dimensional analysis, you could arrive at the same result. That basically, on a very fundamental level, if you took this thing called Planck's constant, which went to zero, then the amplitude of those waves would go to zero as the square of Planck's constant. It turns out it's a square of Planck's constant. So
it's almost analogous to the Planck's derivation of the black body formula.
Exactly. Exactly. It's just as analogous, and it would be nice if people thought of it that way.
What's so interesting to me about this field, so I kind of feel as an experimentalist, I should have long shots and I should have, base hits. I should have, grand slams, swing for the fences, but also get some points on the board. So in this field, what's been so delightful to me is to know that you can measure these effects, but there are guaranteed signals. So inflation is not guaranteed at all. There's no letter from God or, Gaia.
In fact, I'd have to say, generally, I would expect, and that's why I always admire experimentalists. They can spend 20 years of their life on something that I think is a long shot. Generically, I would say it's quite likely that while I think inflation is the best game in town, it's also quite likely you'll never see the signal you're looking for.
Yeah, it could be, right. It could be inflation didn't take place. It could be inflation took place at too low an energy scale.
Generically, it's, in order for you to be able to see it, it's got to be up near the highest level, and it's quite possible that inflation, we all know that if inflation was an order of magnitude lower, then you're not going to see it. I think in this generation, probably while you're alive. Mm-hmm.
And that's why, I think what's been so exciting for me is that, my colleagues in the field have, and some, I have to take some credit myself for making this, more prominent in the eyes of experimentalists. And I see a lot of resonance between what's happening in the current state of the CMB and where I was back in 2001 when I first kicked around these ideas for BICEP. And that has to do with measuring what's called Lorentz invariance violation, which doesn't really get that much attention. There's Levi. Hello,
no, it's
Levi.
Actually Levi's little sister. This is.
Oh, Tasha. That's his baby sister. What's her name? What's her name? Kohen?
Tasha, and she's no, it's not. That religious component is that, and Tasha's 15 years old. She was my mother's dog.
Tribe of Kraus.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
So, what's interesting to me is that we are able to measure departures from fundamental symmetries using the exact same, not like I have to build another detector. And what's so interesting to me is to look at my colleagues, and they're almost apologetic, like, oh, we're only searching for one number. It's kind of like we're searching for the tensor to scalar ratio, and if we detect it, that's great. And I'm like, we're doing so much more than that. And I was just talking to, I won't say which experimentalist, but it's an experimentalist that can only do one number. I mean, literally, it's like a mass of a particle or some transition or resonance, and they have tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe. I'm not crying poverty because the foundation, Heising Simons and the Simons Fund have been very generous to us, but they are really looking for one number, and it may not exist, and it may be a kind of a fool's errand. For us, we not only are capable of measuring, these amplitude of primordial perturbations, but we're capable of measuring things like the mass of the neutrino, which people have not been able to measure on Earth. We have an upper limit and we have a lower limit, but we have no detection, right? So with the CMB type experiments, in collaboration with optical surveys and so forth, we are going to be able to measure for the first time, detect the mass of neutrinos, because we know the lower limit is sufficiently large that we have the sensitivity to make a many sigma confidence level detection of that measurement. So that's one thing we can do in experimental cosmic microwave background science. We're also measuring the properties of dark energy via how these galaxies and clusters of galaxies, how do they evolve? What's their density on the sky as a function of redshift? Again, we can measure things like the Hubble parameter. And as you know, there's a so-called tension or anxiety. As Steven Weinberg used to say, physics thrives on controversy. Luckily, there's no crises in cosmology today. Of course, that was in 1987. So there's a crisis in cosmology from the Hubble tension violently disagreeing at 5 sigma between CMB and optical measurements. Then we have the opportunity to measure what I think is probably maybe even more interesting, see if you agree or not, which is, does the universe obey Lorentz invariance? So not Lorentz invariance, but Lorentz invariance, which is the statement that physics doesn't give a crap about where you are, who you are, when you are, what you're made of, the laws of physics shouldn't depend on any of those properties. And we only have really tight limits from solar system scales and so forth. And it turns out the polarization of light is a very, very, almost the optimal, ideal tool to measure things like parity violation, preferred axes in space, and so forth. So I actually tease my colleagues and say, if God gave me the ability to measure only one thing, the tensor to scalar ratio, or the violation of these fundamental symmetries, CP violation, I would take the latter, because that would really upend physics. We're always talking about, well, we want to be surprised. That would be the ultimate surprise, wouldn't it? If the universe doesn't obey Lorentz invariant symmetry.
Well, of course it would be the ultimate surprise. It will, but for that reason, but it's fascinating to try, and it's important to be able to detect it. And I've written papers on ways to try and probe those kind of violations of something called the equivalence principle. But what's wonderful is you actually took me through. I wanted to get away from BICEP, and I want to say what's next. What might you be able to do? And I wanted to ask you about and you've listed a whole bunch of the scientific goals of why this field remains relevant and interesting, even if you can't measure inflation. But one of the things I wanted to ask you first, tell me about the Simons array, and first tell me briefly about that.
Yeah, so the Simons array is a precursor to the Simons Observatory. The Simons Observatory is a $100 million class project. Both of these projects are funded by the Simons Foundation. The first was proposed in 2012, so it's coming up on 10 years, and it's 3 telescopes. Each one is 3.5 meters in diameter at the Atacama Desert site where we operate for the past 11 years now. And that is at 17,200 feet above sea level, in what was known as the driest desert on Earth, the highest desert. We're the highest construction project on Earth, effectively, that's continually being in operation. We have to build the roads. We have to build the diesel plants that provide electrical power generation capability. We have to have safety managers on site. We have cranes, and we have all sorts of, it's a real honest to goodness, concrete pouring construction site with, you come down there, you need a hard hat. And so that's a precursor that uses 20,000 detectors. The next generation is called the Simons Observatory, which is going to be an array of 4 telescopes, 3 refracting telescopes, not unlike BICEP, but much more capable, much bigger, and also crucially putting the Achilles heel guard on. We are measuring 2 frequencies simultaneously in each of 3 different telescopes. So we can measure the CMB and the dust, and eventually synchrotron radiation, which is a much lower frequency manifestation of galactic electron acceleration. And then we have a 6-meter diameter telescope, which can do the very fine scale, arc minute scale, 1/30th the diameter of the full moon scale, mapping of about 50% of the sky. The South Pole is great, and it was the ideal location in many ways to do what we were doing back in the early 2000s, but you could only at most see half of the sky because the sky is basically gyrating underneath the South Polar cap, and so you only have access to one hemisphere of the sky. From the South Pole, or from the Chilean site, we can see almost 80% of the sky because of its location 20 degrees south of the equator. So it is in some ways a better site from what our perspective in some ways than BICEP. Of course, my feeling is we need at least 2 flowers to bloom. No one's going to believe BICEP. And I used to say this again. If BICEP tomorrow comes out and asks you to write another op-ed, Lawrence, I would think twice. I would think twice if Simons Observatory asks you to write an op-ed, right? Because you need to have confirmation. That is the lesson, not only of BICEP 2, but of almost every experiment to date. And I think,
well, it's the fundamental lesson of science is that you need confirmation. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, and we had said that in the paper as well. So I'm not casting aspersions on my former colleagues. But the bottom line is this experiment will have the capability to do even far beyond what BICEP did. It has more detectors, more sensitive detectors, and the ultimate prize the community is looking at is $1 billion experiment, which has the most winsome, delightful name in history called CMB Stage 4 experiment, which is a Department of Energy / Department National Science Foundation project that could be as much as $1 billion. And you as a theorist might know this, but not. But anytime you hear a number from the experimentalist, always double it if you want to actually operate the experiment for a decade. It costs about 10% of construction cost to operate. So never believe this. Oh, it only costs $10 billion to build the Webb telescope. Yeah, that's to build it and throw it away. If you actually want to use it, it's going to cost another $10 billion bucks. But that's okay.
That used to be 10 billion used to be a lot of money, but that was the old days.
I know. You start throwing around billions and soon it starts to add up. So this project is, it's due for completion on Jim Simon's 86th birthday in April of 2024. And I was just talking to him this morning, and he is more excited than ever. We just got the first accepted at the factory, these telescope, the large aperture telescope, the 6-meter diameter telescope. There's a link on my website to it, scanning around, and it's built in Germany. We have the 3 small aperture telescope platforms are in Chile. I'm going down in a couple months to start setting them up and getting ready for first light, which we'll get first light next year, and then we'll get science quality data the year after in time for his 86th birthday bash.
Well, look, I know you have to go in a few minutes, and so because I have a lot of things I want to cover, so I'm going to be picking on. I wanted to ask you about the CMB for the supernova, but instead I wanted to hit another topic, which is because I have you here, which is kind of unique, and I hope you don't mind talking about it. And it goes back to the beginning, which is your father, Jim Max. Okay, Jim Simons, by the way, as you know, has been on my podcast, and I've known him for a long time, and I have great respect for him. He became very wealthy as a mathematician. One of the reasons he became wealthy, I think, is because he was also recruited really good people like Jim Max. And so it's not an accident that you're involved in the Simons Observatory, because of course Jim Max worked with Jim Simons and to make a lot of money, and that's fine. But I want to ask you, and so it's great if you can leverage that relationship. That's wonderful. It's good for science and good for you, but also good for science. So I don't want to explore that aspect of your relationship, but I do want to talk about the fact that we're seeing how you feel about the modern sort of patrons of science, which is an example of this. Is called the Simons Observatory. It's not called the NSF Observatory or some name of some old NSF official like JWST. Or a NASA official. It's Simons because Simons is providing the money, and Simons has a tremendous amount of money, which is wonderful, and he's using it for good causes. But we're seeing that more and more, that scientists are turning to patrons because those patrons seem to have more disposable income than the U.S. government. And I'm sort of wondering, do you think it's a good thing, or that we're being driven to that, or bad? So you have a personal experience with it, so I thought maybe we'd end up talking about that.
Yeah, we can certainly. So with the Simons Foundation, they've always had an interesting relationship with the federal government in that they have the ability to act as a private organization without some of the fetters of the government kind of bureaucracy. That said, they work very closely with the government. So the current president of the Simons Foundation, as you know, Jim retired. So he's playing golf all the time now. But he retired. So David Spergel is now the president of Simons Foundation. And David Spergel is an eminent astrophysicist, an NAS member, incredible contributions throughout cosmology, WMAP, dark energy. He led the Flatiron Institute, CCA.
He was a student, and we wrote one of his first papers together with me. Anyway, go on.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I was a postdoc. I was at Harvard when he was a student there. Yeah, go on.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Right. So he's and so he didn't choose, somebody from any one of the other computational branches that he works in or he's interested. He didn't choose a mathematician. He didn't choose. So yes, this is a big project. Now the Simons Foundation gives away, I believe, over $300 million per year.
Yeah.
So he's taken an incredible, and it's only in the basic sciences and autism.
Yeah.
And those are, areas, of course, that the government plays a huge role in. And I think they'd be more than happy to only do autism or only do math or what have you. But they see a need and an ability to agilely take advantage of talent without so many different fetters. So, for example, Lawrence, 2 years ago, you may remember, there was a Black Lives Matter protest throughout the world, and in particular, it hit us in science. So we were dealing with COVID. We had a cohort of young individuals who, didn't have any outlet, were protesting social justice, Black Lives Matter. And meanwhile, we were these scientists and we wanted to react, but what are we going to do? We're gonna like change the policing in Minneapolis. Like, what the hell am I going to do? But what I can do is I'm a scientist and I can mentor people. I'm very good at that. I love to educate, and I think I have some abilities to do so. My colleagues, David Spergel and Stefan Alexander, who was the president of the National Society of Black Physicists, we came to the Simons Foundation. We said, we have some discretionary funds here in UC San Diego, where I'm the director of the project office. We're going to use some of those funds to do internships for kids from Black colleges, historically Black universities, to come to places like UC San Diego virtually, or the Simons Foundation. Back then it was COVID, so they couldn't be in person. We did mentorship. You know, we have not been able to do this through the NSF yet. We've been trying for a couple of years now. I'm actually trying to work with the National Society of Hispanic Physicists to replicate this thing, and it has been kind of not, I don't want to say copied, but we've influenced places like the Event Horizon Telescope to also partner with the National Society of Black Physicists. The Simons Foundation, if they didn't do that, there were 30 or 40 kids who each wouldn't have received $5,000 for the summer, written papers, gotten to graduate school. I've got a graduate student who's coming this year. She's from this program. These are things that the government, as wonderful as the government is, are too sclerotic to actually implement in an effective, agile, nimble fashion that the foundation has done. And so they've contributed a lot of things, high risk, high reward. I think what we're doing still qualifies in that way. And I think that they become a model for it. And I think they're tiny compared to the government. I mean, 300 million sounds like a lot, but compared to the 300 billion that was just forgiven for student loans in America.
Well, but literally, it's small compared to what the government spends on many things, but not that small compared to what the government spends on fundamental science. It's comparable, and it's kind of interesting to me. I think you've described how useful the Simons Foundation is in many ways, and I think you're absolutely right. I'm not opposed. I was involved in another program, one of the breakthrough programs funded by a Russian billionaire, and specifically because I thought these are programs where I don't think the public should be paying for it. I think they're so speculative that why not waste someone's private money? Now, the programs you're in are not that way. They're the kind of things government can fund as well. But I guess I want, in the interests of, I return to the James axis. I want to return to the Galileo axis in some sense. Where are we becoming? So Galileo was able to do what he did because he had rich patrons,
right?
And it was good for science. It was good for, it worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
And so, do you think some people wonder or worry about the fact that these projects are going to be determined? What's being done is determined by the whim of certain ultra rich people. Yeah. And so I was going to say, is it a bad thing or a good thing? And I can see arguments on both sides, but it worked for Galileo. Maybe what's wrong with these people who have a lot of money spending some of it on science? And if it's their own personal interest, well, that's their prerogative.
Yeah, I joke in my book. I say, Galileo in his time, he named the discoveries after his patrons. He called the moons the Medicean moons.
Yeah.
And nowadays, what do we call them? The Galilean moons. So I think it's going to work out for scientists just the same. But in all honesty, I think there is. I think the public funding. I mean, the price that it's come to. And thinking purely of scientists right now, I have an 8% chance applying for a National Science Foundation grant out the door of getting it. And that's with a lot of support and overhead at the university. Once I get that money, Lawrence, as you know, my university kindly takes 61% of that to support the philosophy. I'll use your favorite department, the philosophy department. And some of my best friends are philosophers. So
anyway. You wouldn't want your daughter to marry one. Anyway, go on.
That's right. So there's a tremendous burden on scientists. And this is totally absent from my role as a teacher, as an administrator, as a committee chairman, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so much waste. Now, when the Simons Foundation, yes, I had to write a 20-page proposal. I have daily meetings on stewardship, accountability. They do run it. And ultimately, the thing that tickles me is Jim doesn't care what we discover. It's so interesting. He actually, Lawrence, prefers the cyclic models, as you may have gotten into on your podcast with him, but he actually prefers the non-inflation because he doesn't believe that time can start. Yeah. So if he was truly interested, he'd say, like, Brian, make sure if there's any gravitational waves that he actually is so curious about the world. He actually wrote a story called The Last 3 Minutes that I'm hoping to publish someday, maybe in my next book. He is so genuinely curious. So maybe in cases, and I don't even even think of like when I think about Yuri Milner, or I've had Avi Loeb on my podcast, and I said, look, Avi, Yuri Milner, why not just get him to send a spaceship to Oumuamua rather than Proxima Centauri B? And he said, no, he's not interested in doing that. We're going to wait and see what Ruben says. Look, I think ultimately I would worry if there were like speculative people, like people saying, I want to prove that global climate change isn't taking place. Yeah. I want to prove that evolution isn't true.
I'm sure like there are brothers. Well, they're called the Koch brothers.
Although they've had a renaissance now.
Anyway, go on.
But when you have actual scientists at the helm of these organizations, like I think Jim or David Spergel now, I personally don't have these concerns, and I say that as a citizen scientist, right? David is now actually volunteering to lead this program to look for unidentified aerial phenomena at no benefit to himself for NASA. So I think that we all have a strong incentive. We also want to do things for underrepresented groups. As I said, I think these are great things to do, and I think they're beneficial for the scientific community, but also for scientists. And I feel like if that is a priority at least for the US, I think that actually more of this type of phenomenon will be beneficial. I don't think Jim Simon is going to pay $10 billion to launch a JWST-2, but I do feel like there's nucleation. And then, by the way, the government can save money when we build CMB Stage 4 if we collaborate, as we're in the negotiations with them, to leverage our designs, our resources, our personnel, our data analysis pipeline, and combine it with them to maybe reduce it from $1 billion project to 500 million, say. So hopefully it will end up saving taxpayers, not costing.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think this is an important discussion to have, and I agree with you that it might be the thing to worry about is that, or the thing to say is that these people, it's also a small drop in the bucket compared to their net wealth. But it seems to me if wealthy people are willing to spend some money on science, it can't hurt. And he has said as long as the government doesn't give up supporting science at the same time. Well,
look, I don't think that they want to. Right?
No, they don't want to. And I think, look, I know you have to go. Tasha has to go to the bathroom, which is why I'm holding her right now, because she's been bugging me. But I think what I've particularly enjoyed about our discussion, and I hope that the public will take from this, is not just learning a little bit about the science. And I did want to spend some time on your public, your popularization of science. Maybe we'll do that another time. But is the give and take between experimentalists and theorists and talking about these issues that they sort of hopefully can just sit as a fly in the wall and watch the kind of discussions that you and I might have had even if we weren't doing this podcast. So I really appreciated you taking the time to do this, and it's always fun to talk.
And when I was a kid, I thought astronomers would spend all our time on telescopes, but I actually spend all my time on telecons, which I'm going to run to now. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Lawrence.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.